If you are stuck in an avoidant and anxious dynamic, one of the hardest things to admit is that the pattern usually tells the truth before the person does. That is the part people fight the longest. You want the next conversation to change it. You want the next soft moment to change it. You want the next return, the next apology, the next period of warmth, the next deep night, the next vulnerable confession, the next "I miss you," the next almost clarity to mean that this time the story is finally shifting. But when a pattern repeats long enough, the pattern starts telling the truth more clearly than the words ever will. That is what this video is about. Not whether there are feelings, not whether the chemistry is real, not whether the bond mattered. It probably did. This is about how to tell when you are not watching a relationship slowly grow. You are watching the same emotional machinery restart in a slightly prettier form. And that matters because avoidant and anxious patterns do not usually keep people trapped by being all bad. They keep people trapped by mixing real feeling with repeated instability. They keep people trapped by giving just enough hope to interrupt reality. They keep people trapped by letting the story sound more romantic than the structure actually is. So today, we are talking about 3 signs nothing is changing. Not because I want to make you cynical. Not because I want to flatten something that may have felt profound. But because if you are in one of these loops, clarity matters more than comfort. And sometimes, the clearest thing you can see is not what they say. It is what the pattern keeps doing. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. PsychBond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. And before I get into the signs, I want to say one more thing clearly. I know you wanted this to feel real, not like one of those fictional name story videos that can make the lesson feel far away. I agree. This topic works better when it feels like recognition, not distance. This topic works when the viewer feels like the video is describing the exact knot they have been living inside. That is why I am not burying this in character names or turning it into a tidy little scene. I want this to feel like a mirror. I want it to hit in that quieter, harsher way where you hear it and think, yes, this is exactly what kept happening to me. I also think that is why the packaging needed to become sharper. If someone is already hurting in one of these loops, they do not need soft wording. They do not need something vague and clever. They need a title that names the pain fast. They need something that cuts through all the excuses they have been using to stay emotionally loyal to a pattern that keeps cutting them open in the same place. So, before the 3 signs, here is the core idea under everything we are about to talk about. Story is what keeps people emotionally invested. Structure is what tells them whether that investment is safe. Story says, they love me, but they are scared. Story says, we are both wounded and trying. Story says, this is messy because it is meaningful. Story says, the timing is off. Story says, the closeness is real. They just cannot handle it yet. Story says, they do not know how much they feel until they lose me. Story says, if I stay steady, if I stay loving, if I do not ruin the softness, maybe we finally become what this has been trying to become. Structure asks colder questions. What happens after closeness? What happens after rupture? What happens after reconnection? What changes in a stable way? What keeps returning? Which system is stronger, the tenderness or the pattern? Who has to do the work of making the bond make sense every time it goes foggy? Who holds the reality? Who keeps holding the hope? Who keeps getting reshaped by the same cycle? That is the level where this gets honest. Because most anxious and avoidant bonds do not die from lack of feeling. They die from repeated patterns that feeling never becomes strong enough to interrupt. So, let us go there. Sign number 1 that nothing is changing is this: the relief always arrives faster than the repair. This is one of the deepest tells in avoidant and anxious dynamics. Something goes wrong. There is distance, mixed signals, withdrawal, silence, emotional confusion, some kind of rupture, some kind of deflation after closeness, some version of, we got close and now everything feels strange again. Then, at some point, relief arrives. A warm message, a soft return, a vulnerable moment, a small opening, a half explanation, a night that feels emotionally real, a moment that makes the anxious system exhale and think, okay, maybe we are back. But look closely at what came back. Was it repair or was it relief? Because those are not the same thing. Repair means the actual pattern gets named and handled differently. Relief means the pain drops for a minute and the bond wakes back up without the structure underneath becoming safer. That difference matters more than almost anything. In repeating avoidant and anxious dynamics, relief usually comes first, and repair either comes weakly, vaguely, or not at all. That is how the loop protects itself. The anxious person feels the pain of distance, then the relief of renewed contact. The avoidant person feels the pressure of closeness, then the relief of distance, then the pull of loss, then the relief of reconnecting. Both people are getting emotional regulation from the cycle, even while the cycle is hurting them. And when relief arrives fast enough, it can interrupt the harder question: has anything actually been repaired? That is why these bonds can feel so convincing. The body often mistakes the return of warmth for the presence of change. But warmth is not the same thing as change. Closeness is not the same thing as repair. Missing each other is not the same thing as building something differently. And if you are trying to know whether the pattern will repeat, this is one of the first things to watch. Do you keep getting emotionally soothed before the real issue is handled? Does the bond keep getting restarted without the pattern getting reworked? Does everybody soften just enough that the hard conversation loses urgency? Because if that keeps happening, the pattern is not breaking. It is surviving. And it survives by making both of you feel enough relief to stop pushing on the structure. I think this is one of the most painful things to admit when you really care about someone, because the relief can feel incredibly real. It can feel loving. It can feel like proof. It can feel like that beautiful sentence, that one soft look, that one intimate night, that one moment where you think, there you are. This is what I knew was under all of this. And maybe it is. Maybe that person is in there. But if the repair never catches up to the relief, the pattern will repeat. Because the system has learned it does not need to fully change to keep the bond alive. It only needs to offer enough relief to reset hope. Another reason this sign matters so much is that anxious people often become more generous after relief. They stop pressing. They stop asking. They stop naming what hurt. They think, maybe now is not the time. Maybe I should not ruin the softness. Maybe we just found each other again. So the relief does not just interrupt reality. It often makes the anxious person protect the exact conditions that will let the pattern repeat. The avoidant feels safer because the pressure dropped. The anxious feels safer because the closeness returned. Neither person actually addressed the machinery that keeps creating the same pain. So everything feels better, but nothing is sturdier. And if that is what keeps happening, you are not watching the bond grow. You are watching it restart. Sometimes the restart becomes so familiar that it begins to feel like intimacy itself. You start thinking the hard part is just part of loving each other. You start thinking the return is proof of depth because it always feels so emotional after the pain. But some emotions only feel huge because the contrast is huge. The relief after deprivation can feel like love when it is really the nervous system flooding because suffering just eased for a moment. That does not mean the feeling is fake. It means the feeling is not a reliable witness by itself. If the structure underneath keeps collapsing in the same places, the relief is not proof the relationship is growing. It is proof the loop still knows how to hook both of you back in. That is sign number 1. The relief always arrives faster than the repair. Sign number 2 that nothing is changing is this. The same trigger keeps creating the same outcome, even when the story changes. This is where a lot of people get fooled. They focus on the details and miss the structure. They say, "No, this time was different. The wording was different. The reason was different. The timing was different. The tone was different. It felt softer. It felt deeper. It felt more self-aware." And maybe some of that is true. But if the same trigger keeps leading to the same emotional ending, the pattern is still running the show. What are the common triggers in avoidant and anxious bonds? More closeness, more consistency, more emotional truth, more expectation, a conversation about what is happening, a moment where the connection starts feeling real, a moment where the anxious person asks for reassurance or direction, a moment where the avoidant person feels needed, seen too clearly, responsible, cornered by intimacy, or aware that the bond now has weight. Then what happens? Does the avoidant pull back, blur, get strange, go quiet, become less available, turn practical, act normal in a way that erases the emotional reality that just happened? Does the anxious person feel the shift, panic, over-explain, over-give, go into interpretation, become more careful, try to repair the mood, try not to be too much, then wait for the next warm sign? If yes, then the trigger and outcome are still married. And when the same trigger reliably produces the same outcome, the pattern is more trustworthy than the words around it. This is what I mean when I say the story changes, but the structure does not. The story might be, this time they were under stress. This time they had family stuff. This time work was hard. This time they were confused. This time they were tired. This time they did not mean to shut down. This time they are trying. Fine. Maybe. But if closeness still produces retreat, if honesty still produces distance, if asking for anything real still produces ambiguity, if reconnection still turns into deflation, the pattern has not changed enough. One of the biggest traps in anxious attachment is being impressed by variation inside repetition. Because anxious people are often very intelligent readers of emotional nuance. They can detect small shifts. They can feel differences in tone. They can recognize sincerity. They can sense when the other person is more moved than they are showing. But sometimes that gift becomes part of the trap. Because then, the person starts using nuance to argue against the obvious. They say, "Yes, but this version felt softer." "Yes, but this time they opened more." "Yes, but this time they admitted they were scared." "Yes, but this time they said they did not want to lose me." And again, maybe all of that is real. But if the same trigger still leads back to the same structure of pain, the pattern will repeat. This is where I want to be very direct. Self-awareness is not the same thing as change. Naming a pattern is not the same thing as interrupting it. Feeling bad about the impact is not the same thing as behaving differently the next time the trigger hits. A lot of avoidant and anxious pairs have moments of unusually honest insight. The avoidant says some version of, "I know I get weird when I feel a lot." The anxious says some version of, "I know I get activated and start spiraling when I feel the distance." Those insights can be true and still not matter enough if the trigger keeps producing the same outcome. The real question is not, did we understand the pattern this time? The real question is, what happened when the pattern got activated again? Did the ending change, or just the explanation? Because if it is mostly the explanation, then the pattern is still in charge. And there is one more layer to this sign. The repeated outcome does not even have to look identical to still be the same. Maybe one time they go silent. Another time they become practical. Another time they get warm and then disappear. Another time they stay in contact but take all the emotional weight out of it. Those can feel different when you are inside them. But structurally, they may be doing the same thing. They may all be ways of reducing closeness once the bond becomes too real. That is why structure matters. If you only track the storyline, you will keep getting distracted by surface differences. Structure asks the sharper question. Did the same trigger still lead back to instability? If yes, that is your answer. And this is where people often lose the most time, because they keep updating the narrative instead of evaluating the pattern. They say, now they are more honest. Now they are more self-aware. Now they are more careful. Now they are more affectionate. Now they admit more. Now they explain more. But if the outcome still leaves you in the same nervous system state, watch what that means. If you still end up unsure, if you still end up waiting, if you still end up shrinking, if you still end up holding the emotional weight more than they do, then whatever got better in the story did not get better enough in the structure. And structure is what decides whether the pain is going to repeat. That is sign number 2. The same trigger keeps creating the same outcome, even when the story sounds better. Sign number 3 that nothing is changing is this. The bond still depends on one person carrying more reality than the other. This is where structure versus story really matters. In repeating avoidant and anxious dynamics, one person usually has to carry the emotional reality harder. Usually, the anxious person is carrying the questions, the naming, the pattern recognition, the attempt to turn the bond into something explicit and stable. The avoidant person may carry feeling, but not necessarily the same amount of structure. They may miss you, want you, return to you, get pulled back toward you, even care very deeply. But if the anxious person is still the one carrying most of the reality, then the pattern is not likely to change. What do I mean by carrying reality? I mean holding the actual truth of what is happening instead of living only inside feelings. Who is naming the loop? Who is trying to protect against repetition? Who is asking, what are we doing? Who is trying to match words and behavior? Who is trying to make sure the bond has enough structure to not collapse every time closeness rises? If one person is doing almost all of that work, the pattern will usually repeat, even if both people feel a lot. Because relationships do not stabilize through feeling alone. They stabilize when two people are both participating in reality. And this is where the anxious person gets hurt over and over. They often think, if I just stay calm enough, clear enough, loving enough, maybe the other person will slowly come forward more. Sometimes that happens. But very often what actually happens is the anxious person becomes the emotional adult for two. They start carrying not only their own feelings, but the structure of the whole bond. They track the rhythm. They watch for shifts. They manage their reactions. They lower pressure. They try not to spook the other person. They leave room. They interpret silence. They protect the meaning. They keep the emotional file open. And because they are doing so much, the bond feels very alive to them. But that aliveness is being partly generated by their own labor. And if the bond still depends on one person carrying most of the reality, the pattern is going to repeat. Because the minute that person gets tired, stops interpreting, stops overfunctioning, stops holding the bridge together, everything gets exposed. This is one of the places where people confuse devotion with proof. They think, I am doing all this because the bond is special. But sometimes, the bond feels special because you are doing all this. That is a painful difference. It does not mean the bond meant nothing. It means the bond may have been less structurally mutual than it felt from the inside. And when that is true, the repeating pattern makes sense. Because one person is trying to make a relationship out of the fragments, while the other is still mostly relating through feeling, absence, relief, and return. I also want to say something here about why this can feel especially personal. When you are the one carrying more reality, you start feeling that your emotional intelligence should count for something. You think, I can see this so clearly. I can name it. I can even handle it with care. Why is that not enough to finally change it? Because pattern change is not created by one person understanding the truth more deeply. It is created when both people start participating differently. That is the hard line. One person can see the loop perfectly and still not be able to end it by insight alone. So, if you're trying to decide whether the pattern will repeat, ask this. If I stopped doing the extra emotional labor, would the structure become clearer or would it collapse? If the answer is collapse, the pattern is not changing enough yet. And this sign is often the one that finally breaks people open, because it forces them to see how much of the bond they have been subsidizing with their own nervous system, their patience, their hope, their translation of vagueness into meaning, their refusal to call the pattern done because the story still feels emotionally alive. Once you see that, you stop asking only whether they feel. You start asking whether the connection can stand without you carrying it uphill every time. Another form of this sign is that one person keeps having to recover from the pattern while the other keeps having to be gently interpreted. One person keeps paying the emotional cost in real time. The other keeps getting explained. One person keeps having to rebuild their peace, rebuild their clarity, rebuild their trust in their own perception. The other keeps getting the benefit of the softer story. That imbalance matters. Because if one person keeps absorbing the impact and the other keeps being read generously without enough structural change, the loop stays intact no matter how much affection exists inside it. Now, let us bring all three signs together through the structure versus story lens, because that is really the heart of this video. Story is what lets people stay in painful situations longer than they should. Story says, "This is hard because it matters." Story says, "They are scared because they care." Story says, "This cycle exists because the feelings are so intense." Story says, "We are complicated." Story says, "The timing is the problem." Story says, "If I just stay steady, honest, patient, maybe this deep thing finally arrives." Structure is colder, but clearer. Structure asks, what keeps happening after closeness? What keeps happening after rupture? What keeps happening after reconnection? What changes in a sustained way? What gets repaired, not just felt? Who is holding reality? Who is doing the work of keeping the bond from slipping back into its default shape? And if you are trying to know whether the pattern will repeat, structure will almost always tell you before story does. This is why I wanted stronger packaging here. Because people stay too long inside maybe when what they need is a sharper question. Not, do we feel a lot? Not, did they cry? Not, did they come back? Not, did that one night feel real? The sharper question is, does the structure keep pushing us back into the same pain? If yes, the pattern is still stronger than the hope. Another painful truth is that repeating patterns often get mistaken for depth because they create so much emotional intensity. But intensity is not the same as depth. Sometimes intensity is just repetition plus longing plus intermittent relief. That combination can feel enormous. It can feel soulful. It can feel fated. It can feel impossible to replace. But a lot of what feels impossible to replace is actually the nervous system being conditioned by contrast. Cold, then warm. Distance, then relief. Confusion, then contact. Pain, then hope. That sequence creates enormous charge. And if you do not understand the structure, you can call that charge love, when it is often unresolved looping with real feeling mixed in. I think this matters because a lot of people know the story by heart and still do not trust what the structure is showing them. They can recite the explanations. They can explain the other person's childhood, defenses, fear of intimacy, stress, timing, avoidance, shame, guilt, confusion. But explanation is not protection. Understanding why a pattern exists does not stop it from hurting you again. That is why I keep coming back to the same point. You have to watch what the structure does after the story ends, after the big conversation, after the soft reunion, after the warm return, after the vulnerable moment. What does the structure do next? If it pushes both of you back into the same positions, the pattern will repeat. So what would actual change look like? It would look like repair catching up to relief. It would look like triggers leading to different outcomes, not just better explanations. It would look like both people carrying more reality instead of one person doing most of it. It would look like the bond becoming less dependent on interpretation and more dependent on visible behavior. It would look like warmth not being followed by confusion. It would look like contact not being followed by collapse. It would look like truth not being treated like pressure. It would look like the anxious person not having to keep turning themselves down to make the bond survivable. It would look like the avoidant person not using distance as the main tool every time intensity rises. That is what change looks like. Not perfection, just a different structure. And if that different structure is not showing up, then the pattern is probably going to repeat, no matter how moving the story still sounds. So let us bring it all the way down. The 3 signs are: 1. The relief always arrives faster than the repair. 2. The same trigger keeps creating the same outcome even when the story changes. 3. The bond still depends on one person carrying more reality than the other. If those 3 things are still true, then the pattern is probably not done with you yet. And that does not mean the feelings were fake, it means the structure is still stronger than the promise. Sometimes the hardest shift is not getting over the person. It is finally believing the pattern. Because once you believe the pattern, you stop treating every soft moment like a new chapter. You start seeing it in context. And that is where your power comes back. Not in becoming cold, in becoming honest enough to stop calling repetition hope. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.